You're still being a little bit too restrictive for me, and things like that. I'm kind of like he needs to get the stick out of his ass a little bit.
Yeah, or maybe you need to stick a few sticks in your ass.
Get a butt plug, brother. Well, hello. Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And I'm back in Sydney, and Troy is sick. That is what you want in podcast hosts. Jet lag and sickness. Is that right, Troy?
Yeah, I was told from an early age that you don't call in sick, you crawl in sick.
Are you crawling?
I mean, I crawled to the computer, so I guess it's not that impressive, but, you know.
And now you're sitting.
I'm showing up. That's what matters.
I think it's different than if you're an iron worker and you're crawling into work sick, and then if you're, like, sitting at a desk.
Isn't podcasting like the modern equivalent of that, though?
Immaterial labor, affective labor. I think Michael Hart might be on your side here.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so this week we are going to delve into our next book club, the Owls at Dawn Parliamentary Book Club. And we're going to be talking about G.A. Cohen's text, If You're an Egalitarian, Why Are You So Rich? This was Troy's choice. We can get into why he chose this one once we get into the main segment. But we're excited to delve into that. We hope you guys will read along with this one. This one's different. It's actually based on a series of lectures that he gave, these really prestigious lectures in the UK called the Gifford Lectures. And so they're a little bit more accessible than, even though it's still pretty dense. That first lecture where he's talking about a lot of logic and belief and stuff like that might fuck with some people, especially if you're not used to thinking in terms of syllogisms, which he bases a lot of his ideas on certain internal debates and syllogistic reasoning, or what Derrida would criticize as logocentrism. But we'll get into that later. But it's actually a really accessible text. You know, the second lecture is very autobiographical, so I would recommend go out there and follow along with us if you have some extra time to read. If not, we're going to try to unpack it so that you don't necessarily need to read it. But like I said, if you can, I would say go for it. And then we have an announcement, Troy. We did a poll.
We did do a poll. For patrons, the poll was figuring out what we're going to do for our reader-suggested topics. And it looks like the ethics of suicide is the topic that won. It's a cheery bunch, our patrons.
Yeah, I thought that too, man. I thought that too. I was like, damn. But it's actually, I'm really glad that that's the choice of the others for at least this time. And we could obviously delve into, there were some great suggestions about like AI and things like that we can get into in future episodes for sure. So keep recommending, keep suggesting. If you've got ideas, become a patron, or if you're already a patron, just keep being involved in those polls because that was really great. But I'm excited to do this one because it's one of those ones that I think a lot of people have a lot of confusion about, and I myself really struggle through, especially coming out of a more Christian background where it's not as harsh in the Protestant world, but definitely in the Catholic world, you know, it's sometimes viewed as an unforgivable sin. So it'll be really interesting to delve into this. We're going to look at it not from a religious perspective, but through kind of two different opposing philosophical views of Albert Camus and Thomas Nagel, who both address this, and I'm sure that'll open us up to fucking whatever. Or as Troy refers to him as Thomas Bagel, because that's an excellent typo. Yeah. But so we'll get into that the following. Actually, I think we're going to turn it into a two-part, or so, because it's just too rich, and so we'll do that a two-part episode starting next week. So yeah. So again, if you find value in the show, please go to Patreon and support us. $5 a month gives you the whole shebang, bonus episodes and things like that. There was going to be a bonus episode that was going to be out by now, but had to do some rescheduling. But I'm going to be doing an interview discussion with Grace Blakely, who is an economist and researcher on finance and financialization and Brexit and shit like that in the UK at IPPR. So she's going to come on and we're just going to kind of chat about what even is finance, what is financialization, what is neoliberalism, all these terms that are constantly thrown around. So look forward to that in the next couple of weeks, as well as a few other ideas for bonus episodes that are coming. So you can get that, you get the newsletter, you can be a part of suggesting episodes for the future. Patreon.com/owlsatdawn. But first thing we got to do for this episode is we got to prime the pumps. We got to get into the shitty minute. It's the way we start off every motherfucking episode. It's where one of us gets to rant about whatever it is that is chapping our hide for the week or the day or whatever. And it's Troy's turn to vent. So, what's got you, brother?
All right, so everybody who's grown up or been around Southern California for any length of time knows about the august institution In-N-Out.
Oh, yeah.
You're a fan.
I
Correct.
went there multiple times when I was there. I could be plant-based, and I will still devour some In-N-Out.
Didn't you say something about one of the best things about coming back to Southern California after being away for a long time is going straight to an In-N-Out close to the airport and just chowing down on animal-style stuff?
Yeah, I do animal-style fries and then a regular double-double with onions. But yeah, that's like a routine. Unless you fly in at 6 in the morning, which I did this time because they're not open.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the few times they're not open.
Yeah, but literally, we talked about it. So, yes.
Yeah, and it's not like In-N-Out's like the greatest burgers in the world, but it's a particular kind that's really good and is extremely cheap. And it has a bit of it has Southern Californian-ness quality to it, right?
Right.
So I mean, everybody knows about In-N-Out. I think even if you aren't from Southern California, you're at least familiar with the name, right? And In-N-Out's been in the news a bit recently because I guess In-N-Out's a privately owned enterprise by some specific family. I don't know their name. And they're notoriously a very conservative Christian family.
They print Bible verses on the bottom of their like cups and stuff. Well, now it's just John 3:16, but it used to be like different Bible verses and shit.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
But they've been in the news recently because they gave a bunch of money to the GOP for 2018 campaigns for the midterm elections. And so a bunch of people were trying to like hashtag boycott In-N-Out and stuff like that. Are we familiar with this happening the last couple of weeks?
No.
Especially
since I went there multiple times when I was there. You know, I was kind of detached from Twitter though, so
in the past maybe week or so, it's died down a bit.
Okay.
But I wanted to talk about this anyway, even though it was mostly about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we didn't really have we weren't really on a regular schedule because you were flying around the world and whatnot. But it's been in the news, and I just wanted to maybe complain or riff a little bit on this whole idea of boycotting institutions for having debased or just contrary political viewpoints. Like, I don't like that they give money to the GOP. But one, this is not a new thing, first of all. As you said, if you grew up in Southern California, you didn't know that the owners of In-N-Out were conservative and religiously conservative, then you weren't paying attention. They have Bible verses on every product, pretty much. This is not hidden, right? They weren't like pretending not to be this way. Two, pretty much every company executives are in some way going to be supporting the GOP. At the very least, a lot of companies just give equal money to both sides. As Elon Musk was famous for saying, this is like you pick up the phone money, right? They give money just so that if they need to make a call to whoever's in power, they get to get their phone answered. So it's not like this is just about In-N-Out. And then three, I think the most important point, those first 2 points are just, I think, just kind of obvious points that if you think about it over a few minutes, people realize. But I'm not sure what the point of these boycotts are. Now, I want to make a distinction between boycotting as sort of a personal moral decision and boycotting as a political program. If people want to boycott as a personal moral decision, like that's just their prerogative, and I'm not going to tell them not to do it or that they're wrong. I think it's worthless to debate about that specific point. But as a political program, there's probably times where boycotts could work and be important, but the vast majority of the time, it seems like it's sort of trying to compel people to make their own personal moral decision to boycott, like collapsing that distinction. As if we do that loud enough and we boycott and we advertise our personal moral decisions loud enough, then in some sense we'll compel people to agree with us or to stop giving money to the congressional GOP or whatever. And I just don't see how that's even possible. It's straight up underpants gnomes logic, right? From the South Park episode, Yeah. Collect underpants, ? Profit. I just don't know how that's possibly going to work unless you actually get to the point where you've kind of destroyed the company or like their profits just fall apart. And then they're not going to like change their view of the political landscape. They'll just probably hide it better than they
Right.
currently are. So
Yeah.
yeah, shaming people sometimes can work, and there's a very particular place where shame can be an effective tool for sort of corralling behavior. I think I
Mm.
don't want to throw that out completely, but just it's usually used in such a way that it's just I don't think it's effective at all. And I hate to use the term virtue signaling because I think that is oftentimes miscast. But there's some respect to which when you want to talk about sort of personal moral decisions and cast them in such a way that they're going to make sort of clear differences in the material conditions of the world, but you never explain how that's going to happen. You just assume it's going
Right.
to happen. It just seems very problematic to me. And I'd much rather focus our ire on the actual material conditions that the congressional GOP is working towards and that In-N-Out is helping them work towards, rather than just assuming that the way I spend my dollars, the burgers that I buy, is somehow
Mm.
the most political thing I can do with my day.
Right. 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 Um, do you think that this would be an issue if campaign finance laws weren't as loose as they are, and if things like Citizens United weren't realities? Do you think that this would be as much of a potent issue? Because then it wouldn't be corporations, it wouldn't be In and Out that is doing this. It would just be these people who also happen to run this business, and they happen to make a lot of money, and they donate a lot of money, therefore, to a political party that I happen to disagree with. But because it wouldn't be so intertwined, it wouldn't seem like such a valuable choke point in people's minds that they would be able to actually have some sort of effect. Because if people think like I'm doing something by doing this, like I'm making my outrage known or my disagreement known. But if we kind of separated those things, would that be better? Would that be worse? Do you think that's maybe a site of the confusion here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point that I hadn't really thought about. Where having the name of the company associated with makes such a difference, right? Think about Chick-fil-A is another
Right.
example of a place that people have boycotted and still boycott for their company's political leanings, and that's largely because the company brought the politics and religion to the workplace, right? With how they treat employees and they're closed on Sundays and stuff like that. So um, that when people do that, or when companies tend to do that, it tends to draw the ire much more quickly than if the executives just do it in their private life, right? But
Mm,
other than Chick-fil-A, it's usually a distinction without a difference, right?
mm,
I mean, there's reasons why they want the corporation to make the donation and not the individuals, right? But that has nothing really to do with the sort of how the moral value of the donation, whether it comes from
right.
the corporation, which is made by the executives, or the executives independently. And
Hmm.
yet, it certainly draws much more ire when it's the corporation doing it than the individual, just because we know one and not the other.
Yeah. Yeah, it's strange. I really don't know what to think about this stuff. Because and this I think this ties into what we're going to be talking about with Cohen, because there's this issue about ethics and morality that a lot of people want to completely separate from their political engagement, and and I understand that leaning, and I do think that there is a tendency to over moralize in a lot of political, like leftist political opposition, and I think that is inherently if you focus too much on that, I think that is inherently problematic. But with that said, there also is something very appealing about Cohen's remarks, and I think about this, about the idea of a shift or a transformation of ethos that needs to take place in order for there to be some sort of genuine progressive or revolutionary movement. And I mean that not just simply in the Marxist sense, but I mean in the sense of transforming the world, maybe in a broader sense. And that's what this text explores, right? Is it's not just simply, okay, we need to have armed revolution and change the means, or change the mode of production, but it's much more about a holistic transformation of self, society, culture, everything. And that implies some sort of shift in ethos. But ethos translated maybe into ethic or how we live our lives is not the same thing as morality. And I don't like to conflate those two. So we'll get into that maybe more in this section. But I do wonder that like, how do we understand those points of tension between those different ideas in an issue like this? Like, fuck, do we boycott? And then is that just me being like a really comfortable yuppie white dude that's like, yeah, man, I'm gonna keep eating my In-N-Out because I like it, or eating my Chick-fil-A, you know? So I'm just not radical enough, bro.
Oh, I'm like 99% sure. I'm just saying this because I want to still have In-N-Out tonight.
Which again, brother, this goes into the text. This is just segues upon segues here. It's like, why do you do what you do?
All right, so for our second entry in the Parliamentary Book Club, we're going over Jerry G.A. Cohen's If You're Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich?
Can we call him Jerry? I wear the most badass glasses, Cohen. Can that be his nickname?
If you're at your computer, please go to YouTube and search for G.A. Cohen Against Capitalism. He's got a fun little. It's not even a lecture. It's more like a presentation or like a long form argument.
It's like your grandpa's sitting you down and telling you something.
Sit you on the knee, right?
Yeah.
Tell you about life.
Yeah.
And Jerry Cohen's got a pretty amazing duo of hair and glasses. The combo is just, it's elite.
It's elite.
Top form. So Jerry Cohen he's now passed, a analytic philosopher in the Anglo-American tradition who grew up in America, but then taught for his most formative or most infamous years at Oxford, and was sort of is seen by some as sort of being the most prominent left critic of Rawls, and then also a sort of a left critic to Rawls in a way that Nozick was like the right critic of Rawls or something like that, right? So you could see a bit of a triumvirate between Rawls, Nozick, and Cohen, although I'm sure Cohen didn't have quite the impact on academic political philosophy as Rawls or Nozick did. Biographically, I don't think we should say too much about Cohen, though, because the book itself is going to detail a lot of that. So we can probably weave that in and out of some of these pieces. So all I think you really need to know to go in is that he was a political philosopher, a Marxist, although there's an asterisk there. Cohen called himself an analytical Marxist. And we can get into exactly what that means when we get into the chapters on Marxism. But suffice it to say for now, Cohen's an analytic philosopher, so he works with the analytic style of clear, concise reasoning and syllogisms and all the different peculiarities of language that analytic philosophers use, which we can talk about when we see it in the text. And also a Marxist in spirit, at least, if not entirely in letter. So this book, specifically, as Austin was saying earlier, is a collection of the Gifford Lectures, which were given at University of Edinburgh, right?
I believe it is, yeah.
Yeah. And they're famous lectures that are given every year, I think annually. I assume that they are.
I cannot remember because there are some of these that are only given every couple of years. But I don't remember how frequent the Gifford Lectures are given. But yeah, they're really prestigious.
When I was living in Scotland, I'm pretty sure a theologian whose name I can't remember, who's kind of famous for science and religion, was giving the Gifford Lectures, I think.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, because that's one of the things he talks about is the criteria for being offered this lectureship. And Sir Lord, or whatever his name is, Gifford, basically in his will said that he wanted these lectures to, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it's something like extol the wonder and beauty of God. But at the same time, in another note, he says, but it doesn't necessarily need to be by somebody who's religious or even necessarily somebody who practices. And it could even be by somebody who is so-called atheistic or agnostic insofar as they are still sort of like authentically and legitimately trying to plunge the depths of reality. So that's kind of the theme, the loose theme, I guess, that would join together all of the speakers of the Gifford Lectures.
Yeah, talk about an offer for confirmation bias. Yes, I am extolling the virtues of God in everything that I do.
About this tree. Yeah.
So we can say, as made of a preface here, that the beginning of the book and the prospectus, Cohen lays out what he calls the three strains of equality. And so sort of three different, usually exclusive historical notions of equality, at least in sort of the modern era in the English speaking world or in the Western world. He sees these three strains as being Marxism on one hand, liberal egalitarianism on another, and then Christianity on the third. And so he casts these as being three different ones because they have three different notions of equality and ways or paths through which equality is achieved. Marxism being achieved through technological abundance, right, or abundance created through technological progress. Liberal egalitarianism equality is made through constitution making, like a constructed sort of equality. And then three, Christianity is equality through individual moral struggle. So if
Mm.
we all individually moral struggle to conquer our sin and whatnot, then we achieve whatever notion of equality is the goal or the telos of the religious path in general. And he says there's, in some sense, there's kind of some amount of truth and some amount of falsity to all three of them. He sees problems
Mm.
with all three and something to be kind of gleaned from all three, which I think is pretty
Right.
interesting because my thought was that both of us in our upbringing have all three of these as some sort of spiritual
Mm.
resonance to them. Like there's or at
Yeah.
least a residual of these three.
Mm. Yeah, it was very strange to hear him articulate certain sensibilities that I had been aware of in myself, you know, and the idea of being a Marxist with an asterisk and of being a Christian with an asterisk, and then sort of appreciating egalitarian liberalism with many asterisks. I will say that he seems to have fewer asterisks for both, let's say, religion or Christianity, and then, of course, his own Jewish upbringing, which he gets into later, and Marxism than he does for liberalism, egalitarian liberalism. That seems to be like, it's almost like he's criticizing it, but he's criticizing it because he's frustrated that it's not quite what he thinks it ought to be. So it's not like he despises it or is disgusted with Rawls or is disgusted with egalitarian liberalism per se, but it's that there's something fundamentally wrong. And this might be where one of my big points of difference would be with him, but we'll see as it unfolds. But I think he almost views it as being not inherently corrupted, but it's just there are some problems with certain peripheral things, and that the leanings of egalitarian liberalism are still viable. They're still something that we should desire in some ways.
Hmm.
You know? So I'm
I
not
would think that's
sure.
more like the actual Rawlsian view.
You think?
Yeah, especially in the later Rawls. But we can get into the nitty gritty of that stuff a little later. But
Yeah.
I think you're exactly right to say that there's asterisks with all three, and it's
Yeah.
some sort of not necessarily combination, but it's like a mutual symbiotic relationship that has to exist for a more sort of fruitful notion of equality to come about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think maybe my immediate pause is that there is actually a distinction between all three in the way that he articulates it. He wades into like what we, in like post structuralist world kind of refer to as essentialism a little bit, that like Judaism or to be a Jew is a certain way and to be a Christian is a certain way. And so because he's an analytic philosopher, he's going to be much more inclined towards partitioning off these different ideas in their own spheres of influence, and then that there is maybe an essence that is distinct from their qualities, and that those qualities is the level where he's kind of directing his engagement. And maybe that's my point of issue with him, is that there is some sort of external relation between these things rather than some sort of imbuing internal relation between them, that they are sort of co-constitutive in a more Hegelian sense. And even though he talks about Hegel later, and I'm curious to see what his reading of Hegel is, I feel like he's still engaging in this discussion of external relations between these three domains, rather than what I would kind of want to be like, it's messier than he seems to articulate it. But again, I'm with him as a spiritual journeyer.
I think that's good because he's very much talking from his own autobiographical perspective, right? And we can sort of take those remarks and see, hey, what is messier about this than is presented from his perspective? And that can
Mm.
be kind of spurring us on to thought. So I think that's a good practice to have in the first place.
Cool. Cool. Yeah, real quick, one of the things I wanted to say, I kind of hinted at it at the end of the Shitty Minute segment there. So, one of the things he says is that I really, really liked is after talking about how, like, he was raised in a very anti religious home and he was raised in a very pro communist home and things like that. And he says that he thought that the Christian idea of like a transformation of self and personal conversion and personal salvation was never sufficient or desirable or necessary for true transformation of material conditions. He then says, I now believe, this is a quote, I now believe that a change in social ethos, a change in the attitudes people sustain toward each other in the thick of daily life is necessary for producing equality. And that belief brings me closer than I ever expected to be to the Christian view of these matters that I once disparaged. So I thought there was something really interesting in that because I myself have, over the past 6 months or so, kind of been more interested in this idea of a transformation of social ethos. Not a morality, but a more explicit kind of attuning myself to this idea of a total change in people's attitudes, in culture, in lived experience, not just simply a structural and materialist kind of critique, whether of subjectivity or institutions or thought patterns or domains or conscious experience or whatever, but that maybe when we encompass all of those things, what we get is we get a vision of ethos. And that the idea of ethos is something that so many leftists and Marxists are afraid of because they don't want to fall into this sort of ideological trappings that they read in Marx and his critique of ideology, right? That they sort of maybe throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that actually they do have a worldview, a Weltanschauung, right? They do have one, but it's then how do we navigate this elaboration and living of an ethos or a Weltanschauung, a worldview, in a way that isn't dogmatic. And that's something that I think he is struggling with here, at least in the first couple lectures, and I really like that.
Yeah, I think it's super important to struggle with that because the vulgar Marxist position, which may or may not have been actual Marx, but certainly was of many Marxists, or like the orthodox version of Marx, was that all that stuff is like ephemeral, right? It's
Mm,
all epiphenomena. It's all steam coming off the food. And the
mm,
material conditions are what caused that to be whatever it is. And so if you change the social ethos or the religious preferences or views or any sort of ideology on that score, all you're doing is sort of redirecting the steam towards something else, which is not going to affect the what's being cooked at all.
mm.
And so that led a lot of Marxists to just completely ignore all that stuff, right? And that again may not have been Marx's actual view, but Cohen is sort of amongst, I think, many other people in the mid 20th century realizing that's just not the case. There's some truth to that, right? That the material conditions have some sort of effect on that superstructure, but it's a two-way street in some respects, and figuring out what the relations of causation are between things like beliefs and values and social ethos and religion and ideology to material conditions is super messy and complicated. And
Mm.
it's not necessarily just intuitive what those are. So kind
Yeah.
of wading in with your machete in the jungle and digging through all those weeds and roots and stuff is an important task.
Mm. Yeah. So even at this point, there are a few points of tension that are emerging in my mind. One of which is kind of more philosophical. So if I forget, will you remind me about the idea of like linearity, right? And unidirectionality and even bidirectionality. So remind me of that. But here's one that I think might be even more immediately problematic. His whole series of lectures is based on a sort of reclaiming or a reinscription of the idea of equality. Now, we had Seth Abramson on the cast, like last year or whatever it was, and we were talking about metamodernism, and he talks about this idea of the backpack of rights, right? This idea that there are these rights, these good Western liberal rights that metamodernism wants to just open up to everybody. Give everybody that backpack of rights. And, everyone should be able to live in the suburbs and have a white picket fence, and everyone should be able to have access to education, and everyone should be able to, have a certain amount of leisure time or whatever. And some of those things are not necessarily bad, but I do know that there is a movement, particularly something called Afro-pessimism, that would argue that even the idea of equality itself is something that is inherently conditioned by, or that is inherently determined by, a colonialist or imperialist type of logic, an ethnocentric type of logic. You know, what do you think about that? Do you think that there is something about the term equality, of seeking equality as it has been defined, and to try to redefine that or broaden its scope, that is insufficient, because ultimately the term itself is going to be suppressive or repressive or restrictive?
Is the argument that since equality is cast as access to rights and goods and whatnot, then that's the sense in which it's ethnocentric?
Something along those lines. I mean, I think if we did a genealogical critique, a sort of Foucauldian or like Agamben, like genealogical critique of equality, it would be looking how it is that equality came to be, and that you cannot speak about equality without thinking about Western liberal notions of rights, and that entire foundation needs to be deconstructed to help us to think about an entirely different way of what it would mean to live in equal, quote unquote, social relations, or better, or flourishing, or enhancing social relations, but without this idea of equality, because it's too embedded within that Western tradition.
Yeah, perhaps. One thing that kind of gets my goat a little bit sometimes about the genealogical method is I think it's absolutely necessary and appropriate. But then there seems to be a bit of, once we just explain the genealogy, that means like we're done with that. Like
Right.
don't use
We've
that
exposed the contingencies. Go with it
Yeah,
now. Here
the
you go.
emperor's wearing
You have
no clothes,
nothing.
like,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's contingent. Okay, very good. It's important to know that for various reasons. But
Right.
then you got to do something about it. And
Mm.
so one thing I do like about having these three different notions of equality that all have their own separate genealogies that intertwine at different points between liberalism, Marxism, and Christianity. Very complicated relationships between all three, right?
Mm.
Being reactions to each other and stemming out of one another and being opposed and antagonistic towards one another. You have very different notions of equality. So you can't just assume equality means one thing when you have these three very different strains that have complicated relationships with one another. So thinking about the three different notions of equality, I think, can help expose faults in each one and contingencies in each one in a way that's similarly helpful to the genealogical method, but also allows you, I think, to say there's some like area of compossibility. That's a Bajouian term, right?
Mm-hmm.
Compossibility.
It's a great word.
A different area. Yeah, it's a great word. It just means like the possibility of like combinations between things, of overlap. And it's not as simple as just what all three have in common. They must be good necessarily. It's more complicated than that, but it allows for the opportunity to think about that compossibility, and I think that's a helpful way of thinking about how to go forward after you've exposed the contingency of all things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that kind of fits into my other point that I didn't want to forget about this idea of linearity, or like a bilateral movement. So if vulgar Marxism can be criticized for a sort of linear idea of a relationship between base and superstructure, you transform the conditions at the level of the mode of production, and then of course everything else follows from that in this sort of like linear fashion. If it can be faulted for being economistic or deterministic, or maybe a little bit crude in its understanding of the complexities of like the unconscious and society and language and things like that, which I think sort of post-structuralist theorists would come along and complicate, and I think they're absolutely right. That is a deficient caricature of the complexity of human life. However, with that said, I'm not sure that like a bidirectionality is necessarily any better. You know, like I don't know that you go from one point to the next point, and then from that point back to that point, and then they kind of like bounce back and forth. I'm thinking of like the game
Like Pong.
Pong. Yeah, exactly. It's not like Pong. It's so funny that both of our minds went there. I mean, I guess maybe that's like the only game that does that. But yeah, but yeah, I'm thinking of Pong. Like, and then and then you take bits of information, and then you change it when you're at the next one, and that changes that a little bit, and then when it comes back to the base, then it changes that a little bit, and that there's this like nice, neat distinction between these two, and they influence one another as they transform each other and inform each other. I don't think that's right either. Just from like an ontological perspective, I'm not sure that the idea of linearity works here. And this goes to my kind of work on like time and space, and we talked a little bit about Bergson, but like Deleuze and stuff like that. I kind of, instead of seeing it as Pong, I like to see things as like balloons that are being inflated, or like it's much more three-dimensional than two-dimensional. And even that might be a sort of limiting spatial metaphor, but it's much more complex in the way that these terms inform one another, are part of one another, are embedded in one another. So even the distinction between base superstructure for me, or this distinction between like a linear or maybe a bilateral type of relation, still seems not complicated enough. And I'm curious to see how he kind of develops this moving forward. Because I'm not going to lie, man, I had a little bit of frustration reading this at first because I'm just not used to reading people that are so... It felt very restrictive, man. I felt like I was in a straitjacket when I was reading it.
The
Because he's
first
so
chapter,
clear. Yeah, the first chapter. He's so clear, and I was like, ugh, I just wanted to like break free. I wanted to be like, bro, loosen up and have a couple cocktails and then let's talk about this shit. Does that make sense? I know that's like a stupid, banal metaphor, but I feel like he's very like, zoop, like he's zipped up together, and he's like I'm on a path, and I've got my ideas, and here's proposition 1, and here's proposition 2, and here's proposition 3, and here's proposition 4, and I know this is how syllogistic reasoning works in analytic philosophy, and sometimes I enjoy it, but sometimes I'm like, just take a deep breath a little bit here, and let's talk about these terms, and let's not presume that these terms mean what you're saying they mean. Like, he throws the word religion around all the time, and I'm like, bro, what the fuck does religion mean? You're just presuming that religion means some sort of relation to God and the metaphysical, and I think he's presuming that, whereas then he says, but, but then there's like this anti-religious Jewish sentiment, and nevertheless, they're still part of this religious tradition. I'm like, but even that, you're still being a little bit too restrictive for me, and things like that. I'm kind of like, does that make sense? Like, there's like he needs to get the stick out of his ass a little bit.
Yeah, or maybe you need to stick a few sticks in your ass.
Get a butt plug, brother.
Not everyone can just be an intellectual blob and just move on to the next thing, like absorb everything, like you're synthesize every little nutrient or bacteria in your environment and make it become part of you.
We did have an episode. What do we call it? Panphilia?
Oh yeah, panphilia, right?
I want to feel everything, man. Okay, so real quick. So before we get into, so that we can actually make this this argument make sense, his engagement, it seems to be, is that he's really more kind of criticizing Rawlsian liberalism, but from both of those other sides, more so than anything. Does that not make sense? Does that seem right to you?
The other sides being Marxism and Christianity/religion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so because he says this at the end of his introduction, he says, so his first comment is this: after saying, I have never spoken publicly about religion, I've read the Bible a lot, I grew up in Jewish environments, all this stuff, I've never spoken publicly about religious. He says, so this is going to be my first public comment on religion. He says this: Jesus would have spurned the liberal idea that the state can take care of justice for us, provided only that we obey the rules that it lays down, and regardless of what we choose to do within those rules. And I believe that Jesus would have been right to spurn that idea. So that is, I fucking love that, first of all.
Yeah, it was
a
like
Jewish
fire. I hate when people say
Marxist.
fire, but that was fire.
Right. Yeah. A fucking Jewish Marxist who's never spoken about religion just gave like the best theological elaboration of Jesus's ministry regarding justice. Like right there. Like that's Okay, so but to understand that, we have to understand, I think, Rawls's notion of the relationship between justice and the state. So can you briefly explain that?
Oh, what specifically did you have in mind?
So when he says that that justice is something that is taken care of by the state, that it's provided by the structures of the state, so long as we obey the rules as they're laid down. The implication in Rawls is right is that if these rules are laid down, then justice is kind of being obedient within those structures, right? And that justice
Yes.
kind of then emerges from that. So can you talk a little bit about that idea and where that comes from and what that means exactly?
Yeah, so importantly for Rawls, if we're going to kind of sum it up really neatly and quickly, he defines justice not as some like abstract idea that your society has to match in order to be considered just or good. Like say
That's
in
not that's
Plato's
not what.
Republic. It's
Yeah. Okay.
not
So Rawls
Rawls, right?
rejects that. Okay.
He rejects that kind of more Platonic notion. It's like, well, we don't really know what that could be. I mean, it could be a lot of different things. How would you even know such a thing, right? So instead, he wants a much more manageable notion of justice. And so he casts fairness as the best descriptor of justice. So a just society would be one where it's fair. So it's more about the relations between the individuals in the society. That's what fairness is, right? Fairness is a
Mm.
relation you have um, to a structure and the people in the structure, right? So consider like a game. Any game can be fair or unfair. And then there's other reasons for why you think the game might be good or fun or boring or whatever else, right? The qualities, the sort of um, evaluative qualities it might have. But fairness seems less evaluative. You're not saying it's good or bad necessarily. You're just saying it's fair, right?
Mm.
And so Rawls wants to kind of create some principles by which we can say society would exist in this sort of fairness relation. And so
Mm.
famously, he comes up with like the difference principle and the minimax or maxi-min principle. We don't need to go into the specific content of those things, but just to say that Rawls basically wants a society that will allow some inequality between people, as long as that inequality benefits the worst off in the system.
So wait, what does that mean? So like some people would have to pay more taxes because that's propping up people that need a little more help.
Right. Well, you can think about it in being like maybe like a spatial metaphor or like I'm trying to think of like a Tetris metaphor, maybe is what I'm thinking, where
Okay. Mm.
you could have a system where everyone has 5 blocks and everyone's equal, right? But you could also have a system where everyone has somewhere between 6 and 10 blocks. So the latter one has more inequality, but everyone's better off than if there was full equality of outcome. And so Rawls thinks we can
Gotcha.
allow inequality insofar as we're like that second system where there's inequality, but the worst off are benefit from the inequality more than they would if
Mm.
it didn't exist.
Okay.
So anyway, we can talk about more of that stuff later as he actually gets into his critique of Rawls. But the relationship between sort of state and justice is one where it's not about having one specific kind of state or society that can be considered just, and anything that's sort of less than that is unjust or approximates justice or whatever. Many different societies could possibly be just because many different societies, just like many different games, can be fair
Mm.
since it's this internal relation in the structure between the individuals.
Hmm. Okay. And he's going to confront that as being insufficient.
Absolutely, as Rawls himself did later in his life. But
Interesting.
when we get to
Okay.
the chapters on Rawls, we can talk about that.
Cool. Okay.
But then
So
we
I mean,
talk.
do you want to talk about the first one then?
Yeah, let's talk a little about the first chapter. The first
Okay.
chapter kind of revolves around what Cohen calls the argument. It's very mysterious, right? In its lack
The
of
argument.
qualitative description, the argument.
Yeah.
It says it's a paradox, which is a paradox of the fact that we believe a lot of things to be the case, a lot of important things about politics, about religion, about morality, that are constitutive of our identity. Right? They're very important things to us. We value them. We spend our whole lives developing our ideas about them, and we don't easily give them up. Everybody has
Mm.
ideas like this, right? Beliefs like this. And we have these beliefs, and yet we also realize, if we're honest and relatively epistemically humble, I think, that
Mm.
a huge part of why we have the specific beliefs we have is because of the sort of environment we had in developing them. The people around us, the books we read, the movies we watched, our own, maybe even our own sort of personal like psychology or personality as it developed in that environment. All these contingent factors, which really have nothing to do with whether our belief is actually true or not, right? They're
Mm.
not good justificatory material,
Right.
these things. And I think we all, like, this is like psychology 101, right? We all know that this is
Mm.
how we actually come to our beliefs. And so the argument that Cohen presents is that it seems to be a paradox in how important these beliefs are to our identity and how unwilling we tend to be to change them or modify them or give them up, while the entire time knowing that our reasons are no better than the reasons others have for their beliefs, which are contradictory to ours.
Right.
And yet, even when we figure that out, we still hold the beliefs with the same amount of certainty and surety as we did before we knew Psychology 101 stuff.
Hmm.
Did you find that to be pretty convincing, like, diagnosis of the state of affairs?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I'm pausing. I'm thinking if I have. Yeah, I'm with him. I'm with him so far in the argument. I like it.
And so Cohen proposes three possible solutions to this paradox. The first solution he calls the depth solution. And the depth solution just says, well, the reason this is the case is because we have been around our community and our environment for a long time. We've been involved in it. And so we've developed our reasons in it, and our reasons have more depth to them than the reasons we would have to believe things that are contrary to what our community or our environment
Hmm.
held up as esteemable beliefs and values. But of course, that's obviously wrong, because we also know that people who have contradictory beliefs to us have the exact same depth for their beliefs, largely.
Right.
And so that kind of falls apart, right? I mean, this is something I thought was fun to think about in terms of like Twitter flame wars, right?
Hmm.
So much of like Twitter political and philosophical discussion, if you can even call it that, is just looking for someone who's dumb enough to confirm your beliefs about the other side's lack of reasoning.
Mm.
That's a complicated or convoluted way of saying it's like it's a huge just experiment in confirmation bias, right?
Mm.
Just trying to find somebody who makes the worst possible argument for the other side, and
Mm-hmm.
then just jumping on it and using it to sort of extol the rationality and purity of your own beliefs,
Right.
rather than this sort of academic virtue of this principle of charity, like going for the
Mm.
best possible arguments of the other side.
Yeah. 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 There's something. This doesn't. It doesn't entirely relate to that, but there is something interesting that he talks about. He says that these two positions, like your position and the opposing position, don't relevantly differ in quality. That kind of hung me up a little bit, and
What do you think that means?
that's what I was wondering. So this is what I wrote in my note. He said they do not relevantly differ in quality. And I said, do they not? This then implies that they are similar in quality. So, because he doesn't say they're the same, he says they don't relevantly differ. So there's some qualitative difference, but that qualitative difference isn't determining. It isn't relevantly determining in like disregarding them or necessarily identifying the distinction. There's some commonality here, and I think that commonality for him is that site of paradox, that site that I'm quote unquote irrational and they're quote unquote irrational. He holds that idea up. We'll kind of deal with that later, but this idea of, okay, so there is a sense in which there's not a groundlessness, but the ground is a lot less firm than we might think. But so this is what I said. I said, do they not? As in, they differ in quality. I said, this then implies that they are similar in quality. So what are the characteristics by which we can ascertain this qualitative similarity? Is it purely formal? And this is what I think it is. That is, that there are contingent contextual conditions for belief. Or is there another sense in which we can speak of the similar quality. But what I wonder is that there's a formal qualitative relationship in their similarity, insofar as that there are contingent contextual conditions for belief. And if that's the case, then I'm kind of like, so what? So is all you're saying that there are contingent contextual beliefs for people? And I don't think that's the case. I think he's going to go a little bit deeper. But initially at that point, I think that's at least what he's trying to do. That there's a formal qualitative similarity. Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what he was going for. Which,
Okay.
again, I think so what is correct. Like, we kind of know that. I
Right.
think the issue is just we don't internalize it, is kind of what Cohen's getting at. It doesn't actually affect us when we know that's the case. And rationally speaking, it seems like it should. There seems to be some sort of normative quality there where if you it's hard to have the same amount of epistemic certainty about a thing when you know that contradictory beliefs have no real qualitative, no important or relevant qualitative difference.
Yeah. But
So
see,
why
this
is
is
that the case?
where,
Why doesn't it affect us?
yeah. But then here's the strange thing. So then he says at one point that, so then you should be wary, right? He talks about like Catholics and Protestants, and they've got these different ideas, and they've got these, what is it, the depth solution, like the depth of belief. What does he call it?
Yeah, the depth solution.
The depth solution. He says, well, then then either side should be wary. So you should be aware of the kind of relative formal similarity that you have with this other person, and then also be aware of the what we sometimes term irrationality, which he then wants to then say it's not irrational later. And then I was actually thinking a lot about Alvin Plantinga, which I thought was really interesting in this as well, this idea of properly basic beliefs and rationality. But I'm thinking, but we should only be wary if we have some sort of standard of measure by which we're judging this problematic. So then my question is what is this standard of measure that is inducing a wariness within us? Is it not then some sort of standard notion of what a rational belief is? And then if that's the case, then what is a rational belief? And how do we define what a rational belief is? And then the question is does he actually resolve that to say this is still a rational belief, even though you should be wary of the formal similarity, the formal qualitative similarity of yourself with any opposing position?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I don't think you need to define rationality to make this case. I think the case is just look, and everywhere else in our lives, we have these kind of intuitive notions that the amount of evidence you have should correlate and parallel the amount of certainty you have on a thing, right? And so I don't know how cars work, so I'm not going to be very sure that I know how to fix my car. I am pretty sure about how to shoot a basketball, so I'm going to be pretty sure about when I'm playing well at basketball or when someone's playing well at basketball, right? So that's just an intuitive notion we all have every day about everything. And yet in this instance, or in these instances, that seems to break down. We seem to have a lot of evidence that we shouldn't be sure about these things, that they're not quite as evidenced. And yet that doesn't affect our certainty in the same way it does in everyday life. So he's not saying, therefore, I don't think he's saying, therefore, don't be sure about these things. He says, be aware, like step back for a moment, right? Consider it, right? But then we do need to think about why this is the case, because we're not just going to change the fact that we believe these things. They're important about our identity. He makes this point in the creedal cleansing solution. Like one solution is just, okay, throw them all out. Like, don't be certain at all about things that are moral, religious, and political. And he's just like, well, we can't do that. It's impossible. Like, no one does that. These are things that are constitutive of your identity. They're so important to you. I mean, that you can't just throw them all out. You wouldn't really be a human anymore if you threw all those things out. And no one actually does.
Now, I don't want to overconflate, but I kind of want to get a little pragmatic here. Because I wonder, I mean, when you're shooting a basketball, you're not aware of physics and geometry and wind speed and distance. It's more of an intuitive habit.
Oh, I am.
Oh, shut the fuck up. But like when you drive a car, you're not always aware of if it's a combustion engine, of oil flows and all the things that are going on at the time of a spark of an ignition and things like that. You're not aware of all of the inner workings of the machine or if you're driving an electric car, you're not aware of how Elon Musk makes those goddamn batteries. Um, but you know how to drive a car. So there's a sense in which you don't need perfect knowledge in order to function. So I'm curious here as to what is the relationship between knowledge, belief, and then at the same time being able to still achieve a task. And whether or not there's an analogous relation between shooting a basketball and driving a car, even in the midst of relative ignorance, similar to what he's talking about with belief here.
Well, you're talking about practical knowledge, which my examples could have been taken as practical knowledge. I didn't mean them that way, though. I meant them
Okay.
as like it's intellectual knowledge, right? So the knowledge of what it is to shoot a basketball properly and how a car works. Not about driving a car or shooting a basketball.
But wait, so you mean the knowledge of how you're supposed to have your elbow at a particular angle and that you put your hand up and you want it to roll off your fingertips and you want nice rotation, that shit?
Yeah, the analogy was mechanics of a car and mechanics of shooting. That's, I think, where
But
my mind was going.
is that really so different though? Is that not still part of it's just you're just shifting the goalpost. You're still talking about practical knowledge, aren't you? You're
Okay,
still
Heidegger.
talking about
Yeah, I mean, sure. Of course, there's overlap between them, and maybe practical knowledge is constitutive of like propositional knowledge or whatever, right? But
You should
at
see
the
the
same
smile
time,
on
I
his
don't think
face.
that.
He's looking at me. He's got that cheeky smile on his face, like, all right, fucker.
Yeah, shit-eating grin, continental philosopher. There's still a sense in which intuitively every day we have this notion, and maybe it's wrong. Like that's open possibility. Maybe it's wrong, our intuitive notion of how evidence correlates with certainty. It
Yeah.
may very well be. It's probably more complicated than our intuitions tell us, but we at least have that intuition, I think. And
Right.
so let's see where that takes us. And if it
Yeah,
takes
because he
us,
does.
yeah,
No, yeah, because he does talk about the distinction between analytic and synthetic later, and then he talks about how Cohen's solution is that there is no distinction, but that he himself still holds on to that distinction. So he still believes that there is such a thing as analytic propositional knowledge.
which he wouldn't believe if he went to Harvard.
Exactly, which we can talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've talked about two of those possible solutions: the depth one and the creedal cleansing, or the just throw them all out proposal. And those both he thinks don't work. There's a third one, which is the nurtured. I think he calls like nurtured beliefs or something. It's the idea that kind of like the sentimentalist objection, which is, we believe these things, moral and aesthetic and political and religious. We have differences in our beliefs about them, but that says more about our tastes and our preferences than it says about the things themselves, if there even are things themselves, right? So it's like,
Okay.
it's like ice cream. You like different kinds of ice cream. I like different kinds of ice cream. It's just our preferences that matter. There is no like necessarily objective best ice cream out there, and your taste has to approximate it to be considered good. We call someone snobbish or arrogant or whatever if they think that's the case. And Cohen also says this is a bit of an issue because we often do think it's actually about having better judgment or sensibility. And we don't have that in ice cream, usually, although there are some aesthetic tastes in which people might say you can cultivate them properly. But certainly in the moral and political realm, we tend to think there's some sense in which you can have better or worse judgment, moral judgment, or better or worse moral sensibility towards the world. And then, if it wasn't the case, if it is just all, ice cream preferences all the way down, then why do we disagree at all? We shouldn't disagree. And yet we do. We give reasons for why we have our moral and political beliefs. We develop reasons for them. We agonize over them. And we don't do that about ice cream. We don't even feel any need to. So it's really like this entire human tendency towards developing reasons for our beliefs and agonizing over them. Like all of that's irrational if this critique is true, which basically throws out a huge part, if not all, of like intellectual life.
Do you think that it really matters whether or not we retain these terms of rational and irrational? Like, I feel like he's clinging so tightly to try to prove that these tendencies, that these paradoxes don't lead to irrationality. And I'm kind of sitting there saying, well, so what? What if they are irrational? maybe the idea of rationality itself is inherently deficient as a term. You know? Like, maybe nonsense is important.
Yeah, but I mean, my sense is that it's only important because we've developed an argument for why it's important, which is an irrational exercise.
Exactly. There's a self-referentiality here that I keep saying that's quite interesting.
Yeah, and so there is probably, and analytic philosophers do this, and I don't like it, where they cling onto a term and like fight to the death to defend it,
Right.
which seems like it's not really getting to the actual nature of things.
Right. Or in this case, to avoid irrationality. Yeah.
Or clinging onto the term to avoid irrationality. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no. I'm saying you're saying sometimes you cling on to a term, or sometimes you avoid a term, and so he's trying to avoid irrationality.
Yeah, definitely. You don't want to go down that tunnel.
Right.
Which, yeah, I mean, continental figures might be like, let's just go down and see what happens.
Yeah, exactly.
Which might be worthwhile.
Yeah.
I don't think that difference between analytic and continental philosophy exists as much as some people think it does. I think it formally does, and maybe in terms of sort of the aesthetic nature of the exercises that they do when doing philosophy, the philosophical or philosophy as exercise, right, that you actually practice and do. But as far as content's concerned, I just don't think they actually differ all that much. I think continental philosophy cares a lot about rationality by the very virtue of the fact that it develops arguments for its positions and presents them in such a way as to be persuasive, even though it's a different kind of persuasion and uses different tools of persuasion. And so, yeah, I just think that exists more formally than it does in terms of the actual content, even if there is some difference in content that's important, I think.
The only thing I wonder, so I'm reading this, and it's this section on, like, right after he lays out the argument with the three propositions and the conclusion, right? And so the conclusion is basically, so the beliefs that he's described are irrational, right? And so here are the three. It's, 1, it is not rational to believe P rather than Q when you know that you lack good reason to believe P rather than Q. So it's a groundless belief. You know you don't have a good reason to believe it, but you do believe it. That's not rational. Okay. 2, you lack good reason to believe P rather than a rival proposition, Q, when you cannot justifiably believe that your grounds for believing P are better than another's grounds for believing Q. This is what he calls the principle. Okay. 3, in a wide range of cases of nurtured belief, people who continue to believe P can readily be brought to realize that they believe P rather than Q, not because they have grounds for believing P that are better than the grounds for believing Q that others have, but because they were induced to believe P without being supplied with such differentiating grounds. Again, okay. Therefore, 4, the beliefs described in these 3 are irrational, and the people who believe them are therefore irrational. So he calls this the argument. And this is the paradox here. So, but then I'm actually wondering if he isn't, now I don't know if he does this, but if he isn't actually deconstructing the very relation between rational and irrational itself. Because this idea of, then he says, so if the argument is sound, then people are starkly irrational in contexts where we do not normally account them as irrational. It is not, of course, news that people can be irrational, nor is it news that it can be puzzling to see how they manage to be so. What's puzzling here, if the argument is sound, is not that people can be irrational, but just that we do not normally consider beliefs of the sort that I have identified as instances of our, perhaps even commonplace, irrationality. So we don't consider them as being rational, maybe because of sort of like post hoc rationalization, right? He mentions that as well, is that there is a sense in which we sustain our beliefs by then kind of like coming up with rationalizations for it. So this is what I wonder. Examining post hoc rationalization, this doesn't, like, when you do that, you aren't retroactively rationalizing something that is irrational. Just because you can have an argument or an explanation for why you believe something that was previously deemed irrational, that didn't have a foundation for it, that doesn't mean that you somehow like reclaim that space as being rational now. And I think he thinks that it does. Am I wrong?
I'm not seeing what you're getting at.
So he's saying that these beliefs, like, okay, the reason that he comes down on the side of against Quine in the Quine and Ayer debate, he has rational beliefs for it, but he wants to then justify the reason that he has these beliefs as not being irrational. But does he not do that? Does he not say that ultimately because he does have some sort of rational argumentation for believing it? So it's not irrational. It's not completely baseless and groundless and stupid, so to speak. So in that kind of like elaboration of that tension between irrationality that then becomes rationalized, I almost feel like he's claiming that he's somehow taming the wild irrationality through post hoc rationalization. And that sort of like reinscribes a previous domain of irrationality into rationality.
I don't think he's claiming that. Is that
You
you're
don't
saying
think
that
so?
he?
Okay.
No, I don't think so at all. I think what he's saying
Okay.
is, I think he's leaving this chapter at the paradox, kind of, and saying, look, we all engage in this post hoc rationalization process, right?
Okay.
And that process involves giving reasons, and those reasons might be good reasons, right? But then lurking behind that, there's always this not good reason, which is that other people also have good reasons for their beliefs, and they're totally contradictory, and there's no reason to think my good reasons are better than their good reasons, other than the fact that it's because of their community or environment or whatever that they grew up in or were
Okay.
around. That's why he compares Oxford and Harvard, right?
Okay.
And so I think what he's saying is, even in this process of giving reasons, there's a seeming irrationality lurking in the background, which I think is going to be material for him to deconstruct that barrier.
Mm.
He's just saying you can't really believe that human cognition and intellectual development is just purely, or can be purely rational from the get-go. It just can't really happen that way. With the definition of rationality, that's just kind of very simple. Develop the best reasons, make predictions, test them. Kind of scientific instrumental rationality kind of a thing.
Mm.
I think he is complicating this
Yeah.
relationship, because it's definitely not as simple as this easy binary between rationality and irrationality, as is stated in the quote unquote principle.
Right.
So yeah, I think, and if he doesn't do that, I think we can come back to it and say that's an issue. We can talk about what rationality is and isn't in its relationship with irrationality.
Mm. Yeah, so then in that case, what you're talking about earlier, that the sort of distinction between continental and analytic concerns in philosophical discourse, at least at this point, don't seem to be so far apart, because he is kind of engaging in a deconstructive act of these presumptions that people tend to have about these terms, rationality and irrationality, and the viability of having an irrational belief, and whether or not we should just simply like discard that or like mock somebody for being irrationally, I don't know, clinging to faith or something.
Yeah, he's just not doing it in such a way as to sleep with all of his students, like a continental philosopher would.
Yeah.
Too real? So that's the first chapter. And the second chapter is really just, we can kind of go over this quickly, I think.
Okay.
A little autobiographical description of Cohen's childhood and early academic development. And it's probably better to read this, but we can just kind of bullet point it, I think, fairly
Yeah.
quickly. His mother was from Ukraine and his father from Lithuania, both Jews. His mom was well-to-do, and his father was kind of working class, I believe. And they both came to Canada, emigrated to Canada, met there, were both working class in Canada, and worked in the garment industry, and had these kind of old school Stalinist, anti-religious views, even though they were Jewish. And he went to a Yiddish day school in Canada. It had a very it was Yiddish, but it had a kind of anti-religious bent to it, and all the religious holidays were cast into secular holidays, and it was very working class and solidarity and all that kind of good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It collapsed during the Red Scare. I think there was some talk about possibly being framed or something by some.
Yeah, it wasn't his school. It's like I can't remember what the name of his school was. It wasn't his school in particular, but it was the organization that funded his school that was found to be possessing leftist, communist literature or something like that. And then so because they got raided, it scared a lot of the people. So his school was called Morris Winchewski. And then a lot of the people parents withdrew their children from Morris Winchewski School, and so even though the school was able to continue to run, the population dwindled so much that it made full-time operations impossible.
Right. And so he went to a Protestant school after that, and there were some lovely descriptions of the way Protestants treated the
Well, because it was
Jews.
90% Jewish students, but 100% Protestant teachers. And so there was some interesting conflicts, I
Very
guess you
weird.
could say. Yeah,
Yeah, I love that part of the chapter.
me too.
And like
Yeah.
the real important part of the story is when he becomes, sort of a late adolescent into teenage years and into his college years at Oxford. He really experiences Judaism for the first time. He's Jewish, but his parents were very anti religious, and so it's seeing the Quebec. Is it Quebecy or Quebecois?
Quebecois would be plural, no?
Yeah, for the plural for people from Quebec.
I believe so.
It's a bit Quebecois Jews and how they differed from the working class kind of Jewish atmosphere he grew up with, and then the British Jews, who were fully integrated,
Right.
basically no different than the Brits and the English.
Except their last names that he knew, and he was
Yeah.
like, "What the fuck?" He's like, "You're not different, but your name is of my people." Yeah.
Yeah, I thought he put it an interesting way. He said they didn't have to sacrifice anything to be Jewish, or much of anything, in the way the Canadian, first generation immigrant Jews had to. And so he talks all about this, and then going to Oxford and doing all that stuff. And I thought that was really interesting to think about and compare to our own experience, because there's some ways in which I think we went through like reverse process when it comes to religion and sort of the secular, philosophical, socialist, whatever you want to call it, ideological apparatus, where we were involved in religious institutions that were fiercely anti that stuff, and then came to found some like moment of confluence between what we thought of as our religious identity and those notions of justice and that were involved in sort of the left-leaning sphere, in a way that is kind of parallel to the way Cohen seems to have been in this sort of Marxist, really religiously Marxist upbringing, and then find some form of confluence in the Judaism practiced by people in his high school and in these summer camps that he went to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've been to Jewish summer camps, have you not?
I used to work
Been
at
a
Jewish
counselor.
summer camps. Yeah, I was. I was a video director for Jewish summer camps. I know. I was when he was talking about when he first mentioned camp and summer camp. I was like, is he going to talk about Jewish summer camps? I got really excited, and he does. I was like, yes, I know exactly what he's talking about. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really liked, he says that, he's talking about, this hypocrisy of undergoing a bar mitzvah even though you don't believe in God, right? And it's like this tension, like you do the thing even though you don't really believe in it. And he says, I wouldn't call it hypocrisy now. Now I'm older and I believe in preserving tradition. And I loved that. I thought there was something so interesting about that because he's coming at this from anti-religion into kind of having an anti-religious. He doesn't want to say a pro-religious, but it's an anti-religious. Whereas I feel like my tendency is coming out of religious into the secular, and it's like I'm dealing with this. I'm not anti-religious. I'm not pro-religious. I'm not anti-secular. I'm not pro-secular. There's a much more tense relationship between all of these spheres of overlapping. And to hear him struggle, I actually felt a kinship with him because I was like, I kind of understand this journey.
Yeah, exactly. And that in Sunday it's definitely not a good tension sometimes. Like, there's one point where he says he's not a Zionist at all, but he feels a connection to the Jews in Israel. And a lot of that connection is one of, what was the word? It wasn't like dread, but like, not shame, but it was like sort of like a negative affect.
He did say shame. He said when they launch attacks on settlements, he says, I feel ashamed.
Yeah, and so and even though he's not doing it, right, he feels some sort of connection to that. And that's exactly how I think about when I see things happening in the Christian community. And I think to myself, that's not me doing that. I've been against that for the majority of my adult life. And, even when I was in it, I had concerns about that and spoke out against that kind of stuff. Why do I
Mm.
feel this sense of like collective shame about it? But that's it. That's a real thing. It's not like a weird pathology.
Mm. So here's a lovely quote. He's talking about this connection to the non-communist Jewish world at one point, which he says he found it to be ambivalent. He says, "I was drawn toward it and repelled by it at the same time. On the one hand, its citizens and I were of one substance, from one history, connected together with one still recent rending tragedy. On the other hand, they rejected my beliefs, and their beliefs, for me, were unheroic and conformist, lacking in courage and adventure." I'm like, fuck, I love that so much because that's very similar again to how I kind of, one of those points of tension that I have with Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, you may not like analytic philosophy, dude, but he's a pretty damn good writer.
He's an excellent writer. This guy is an I mean, I've read some analytic philosophy that's so dry and
Oh
like,
my god, it can be so bad sometimes.
yeah. But this guy's an excellent writer.
Yeah, and I love that a lot of analytic philosophers tend to just pull their punches in their writing to never make the strongest claims possible. He's got no problem with that. And sometimes he overreaches, and he's been accused of that on a lot of times. But yeah, he has no problem saying strong, making strong claims, or saying strong things, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
Ask forgiveness, not permission. All right, so that's a pretty good wrap up, I think, of these first two chapters. Hopefully that has gotten anybody interested in reading this book. You can certainly join us from here on out if you want and read the book.
Yeah. Yeah. And moving forward, now that he's set this up, he's set up his kind of a complication, let's say, of the idea of belief, this paradox of conviction, as he calls it. And then he's moved into his own sort of personal biography that elucidates his connection, his quote-unquote irrational connection to his past and these tense domains of meaning and identity that he's wrestling with. He now moves on towards talking about like the development of socialism from utopia to science. He talks about Hegel and Marx, the opium of the people. He talks about equality, and then he goes on from here in a series of lectures, and that's how we're going to kind of proceed now. But I think it's so important to understand how he sets it up because there is something really interesting, and I don't know what he's going to do with it yet, but there is something really interesting to be aware of your past and your history and to feel that deep connection to the multiplicity that we are embedded within. And I think that's what I am excited about, actually, to see how he fleshes that out, because that's right up my alley, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And not to just reject that stuff as being like sentimentalist garbage.
Yeah, or like psychological shit or something. No, there's something profoundly ontological and structural and political and ethical about it. It's not just, I just have these memories and shit like that, and it's this ethereal thing. No. We are materially in it.
I like that.
Yeah, it just came to me. Shit.
Can we call this episode Materially In It?
Yeah.
All right, so for our last section, we're doing the sticky leaves. This is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's bringing us meaning in a possibly otherwise meaningless world, although we haven't determined for sure that it's meaningless, but it might be.
By the end of this podcast, we will. Spoilers for the season finale, or the series finale.
Series finale? Ooh, that sounds grim. So, Austin, what is your sticky leaves this week? Or these last however many weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I got a ton, man. I listened to some good podcasts when I was in California because I was driving a shit ton. I went fly fishing in the mountains, which was fucking perfect. I got to officiate my sister's wedding, which was literally one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had. Joyous. It was like the perfect pitch of emotion, friendship, community, family, and a tinge of drama, which you have to have at a family gathering. You know, we're like, because it's like divorcees and, you know, exes are all coming together for the first time in years and people get left out or whatever. So there's a little bit, but it was so minor that it just was like, yeah, that's kind of what we expect now. But it was so perfect. And that was great. But that's not going to be my sticky leaves. I'm going to do something a little more academic. I have been listening on Audible ebook, or audio, I guess an audiobook, to a book called Dark Emu. And Dark Emu is an anthropological investigation of Aboriginal history from the letters of the earliest explorers that arrived in Australia. So, so much academic work is based on secondary sources, right? This book is intentionally focused on the primary sources of the early letters of the colonialists who arrived, as well as early letters or as early as possible documentation of Aboriginal people as well. And then, of course, traditions or like records, I guess, that have been passed on within various Aboriginal tribes around Australia, documenting their ancestors' experience of this colonial invasion. But it's called Dark Emu, and it's by a gentleman by the name of Bruce Pascoe, who himself is, I don't remember which tribe from which he descends, but he himself is a part of Indigenous Australian heritage. And it's a really lovely book. It basically overturns so much of anthropological history. Even some of the stuff that we've covered on this podcast, we talked about it, the greatest mistake in human history or whatever, the shift from hunter-gatherer to agricultural farming, and how that led to the emergence of inequality and division of labor and various other hierarchical strifes and things like that, that a lot of sociologists and anthropologists like to discuss. And this book kind of tries to say that actually it's potential that even as of 40,000 years ago, a lot of these Aboriginal tribes had permanent settlements. And there are architectural settlements all around Australia that are thousands of years old that seem to confound the simple story that there were hunter-gatherers and then people shifted to agricultural farmings. And one of the reasons that that's politically important for Australians is that one of the justifications against Aboriginal, or what they call it black rights justice over here, of their integration is because they justify a lot of, like, let's say, institutional whites will justify their embedded nomadism that prevents them from actually being able to integrate properly into quote-unquote Western civilized static societies. So what Bruce Pascoe is saying is that, listen, well, first of all, that just seems inherently racist, and it is. But what he's trying to do is provide a sort of historical justification to demonstrate why it is the case that these individuals aren't just genetically nomadic, but that actually they have had settlements, permanent settlements, for thousands of years, even longer than is documented elsewhere in Europe or Africa or in the United States, at least in common literature at the moment. So not that there's no literature that doesn't discuss that, because there is, but it's definitely not the mainstream or kind of popular understanding. And so he talks a lot about, farming techniques and architectural techniques and things like that that characterized Aboriginal life. And it's just really fucking fascinating. And I think it's really lovely, as well as him talking about the agricultural methods of Aboriginal people that were quite sustainable and that actually used the land, like controlled fires and things like that, that helped to like churn up the soil and burn away dead brush, and that those things were done and they were planned as they were cultivated over thousands of years, because those were amazing farming techniques to be able to sustain agricultural growth. And he talks about a lot of the fishing techniques, and there are these like fishing traps. I can't remember. I think it's in Queensland, and there are these settlements that there are these like dams and fishing traps that have been there for thousands of years that would cull fish into these little areas so that they could easily, capture them with like nets and shit like that. And when you look at that stuff is not the product of nomadic lives or of nomadic peoples. That's the stuff of settled peoples, right? And now there were some tribes around Australia that were more nomadic, and then there were some that were partially nomadic, and then there were some that were more kind of permanently settled, all at the same time, contemporaneously with people. So he just really is trying to create this really lovely anthropological history that overturns so many stereotypes about Indigenous Australians. And I think it's a wonderful text. I would definitely recommend for people to check it out. He actually has a lot of talks online. His name's Bruce Pascoe, so you can check that out. It's Pascoe. And so you can listen to him talk about his book if you want kind of a shorthand version of it, because he'll give like an hour and a half discussion of of some of his ideas. The book is kind of a cultural phenomenon here. Like a shitload of people are reading it, so it's really good. Now, I was at I'm part of a reading group here that gets together, and we did have an expert actually in indigenous struggles and studies come and talk to us. And from a Marxist perspective, he has some criticisms of the text because he thinks that what Bruce Pascoe is maybe trying to do is he's trying to sort of say, well, we had accumulation as well. That Bruce Pascoe was saying we had storehouses of grain. Aboriginal peoples had storehouses. We did accumulate things. And the reason he's making that argument is that the idea of accumulating resources is sometimes attributable to civilized society. And so what this Marxist critic was saying is that he felt that Bruce Pascoe was clamoring a little bit too much to be included into that idea of civilization that is proto-capitalist, according to like the Marxist critique. That is the condition out of which the enclosure of resources would take place under capitalist exploitation, right? And primitive accumulation or primary accumulation. And so this gentleman, I fucking forgot his name. He was awesome. But he was kind of like, I don't love that element of Pascoe's argument because he's trying too hard, I think, to be included into this idea of civilization. Whereas, yeah, they had storehouses, but they had storehouses of like 4,000 pounds of grain, which is like fucking nothing, or 4,000 kilograms, which is like fucking nothing. And it was just like one area, not like all of them. And so this idea of trying to be maybe included into the idea of civilization, like a civilized society, even in a pre-civilized context or an antiquarian context, is something that he didn't love. But nevertheless, the book is fucking fantastic. I say check it out, especially for people who want to learn a little bit more about Australian Aboriginals. So Dark Emu, good shit.
That sounds really interesting, dude. I think I heard David Graeber recently talking a bit about something similar, where he was saying, and
exactly.
I don't know what book it is that he was arguing this in, but that this sort of linear history whereby nomadic peoples settled down, agricultural communities developed, and then the axial age, and then everything, is just not at all what the anthropological record shows, and that lots of peoples were simultaneously settled while others were nomadic, and then some went settled and then realized it sucked and went back to being nomadic, and then back again to being settled, and then they find some architectural sites where it looks like people just abandoned it, like it didn't get destroyed or anything, they just abandoned it, and they think that they just became nomadic again because being civilized sucked ass or something.
Yeah, or the weather shifted and the season changed. Like they built up these architectural sites, and then the winters got really severe, and they were like, "Fuck this, we're going south."
Yeah, and then their social forms changed. So like there were some communities that would be settled during the winter and then would be nomadic during the summer.
Yeah.
And their social formations changed. It became much more hierarchical when they were settled, and then became much more free form. So like women would be leading cultural groups when they were nomadic, and then when they came back into their settled form, they would have much more strict patriarchal hierarchies and stuff. And that was all really interesting to think about how much more nuanced and complicated these things are than the very simple linear history that usually taught us common sense.
I just gotta say, I think that lifestyle is so appealing to me. Because sometimes I'm a really disciplined academic researcher, and sometimes I just like to fucking drink and go out and be a dumbass. And sometimes I like to really work on art projects and do films and things like that. And sometimes I want to just be, I don't know, podcasting. I love this idea. Let's just be fluid with our shit, bro. Hierarchical fluidity.
You want it into the wild on Sundays, and then by Monday you're after the hangover. You're back at your desk.
Yeah, exactly. And then I'd be even cool if we did it seasonally. Like in the summers we all go to the beach and we surf and we go hiking along coastlines and stuff like that. And then in winter we go to the green sheep fields of Ireland and we sit by log lit fires and we read Proust. That's
the solstices, man. We used to have that shit back in the day. But now everything's straight laced, and you gotta. I mean, if you make any mistakes, it's gonna be on Facebook or on Twitter.
Damn it! I try not to romanticize the past, but that sounds pretty fucking awesome.
Yeah, in secret, you gotta run around naked, sacrificing ghosts to Satan.
Sometimes
you just gotta do it.
I'm so down. I love it. So yeah, I would say check out the book. It's really good, and it's one of those books that I don't feel guilty about listening to on audiobook because it's a flyby type of encounter. It's really good.
So you're saying you wouldn't listen to Phenomenology of Spirit on audiobook?
Bruh, I tried to listen to Discipline and Punish on audiobook, and I was
That
like, I
sounds
feel
terrible.
yeah.
All right, so that's it for today. If you want to go and find us on iTunes and give us a 5-star review and rating, or 5-star rating and review, excuse me, then we'd really appreciate that. It helps us get the podcast out to more people. Do find us on Patreon, patreon.com/owlsatdawn, or just Google that, and you can subscribe. $2 will get you into the democracy where you can vote on future episodes, and $5 gets you that plus the bonus episodes and everything else. Oh, the $2 tier also gets you the newsletter, I believe.
Nope, $5 tier is the newsletter and bonus episodes.
Shows how much
$2
I know.
is democracy, but that's okay.
Yeah, $2 is the democracy, gets you a vote, and $5 gets you the newsletter and the bonus episodes and all that good stuff.
Yep. Did you say Twitter? owls_at_dawn. You can email us with any questions or thoughts or anything like that. owlsatdawnpodcast@gmail.com. We also have a Facebook page where if you're not on Twitter but you want to be kept informed of any information about polls or new episodes or guests or when new episodes are out, you can go to Facebook and you can like that page. I think
We're
that's
just
it,
on
right,
all
brother?
the platforms, man. We're on so
We're
many.
we're there, brother. Except we haven't built out ourselves on other platforms yet. I keep saying we're going to in terms of like podcast platforms, like I don't know, Podbean and Stitcher and Spotify.
There's
but
too
soon,
many, man.
I know. Soon,
You know
though,
all those
guys.
movies that show a future where like all the different technological devices are easily like integrated into one another?
Yeah,
Like no one foresaw this obvious future in a capitalist system where there's 50 million different proprietary technologies and none of them work with each other.
well, they tried to do that with Google Plus, right? That was supposed to be the thing. It was this integrated, just a one-stop shop kind of thing, and nobody uses it.
Yeah, exactly.
Except
It
for
probably
you.
still exists somewhere in like the technological wasteland, right?
Yeah. All right, I think that's everything. Is there anything else we got to do, brother?
Just one more thing, dude.
What's going on?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.